Best indie rock, psych, and post-punk from artists around the world, including Chicago's Deeper, Nashville's Bully, and Irish band Fontaines DC. Tune in all summer long and discover something to love.
The Cummer Museum of Art and Garden's new exhibition, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, on view through September 29th. Visit cummermuseum.org for more information. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, dark money in local politics. We explore the complex network of campaign financing that's behind a series of controversial mailers showing up in voter mailboxes. Then, 50,000 acres connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Okefenokee is now a state preservation priority. We discuss what it means for conservation efforts in Nassau County. Plus, teaching water safety to kids on the autism spectrum. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also tag us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. President Biden is expected to return to the White House today. NPR's Tamara Keith reports he's been recovering from COVID at his Delaware home.
Biden hasn't been seen in public since he tested positive for COVID, just as his bid for re-election was unraveling. On Sunday, he announced he was dropping out of the race with a letter to the American people posted on social media. Yesterday, he called into the Now Harris campaign headquarters in Wilmington, his voice raspy, to rally staff in support of Harris's run. Biden's doctor says the president has completed a full 10-dose course of the antiviral drug Paxlovid, and his symptoms have almost resolved completely. Tamara Keith, NPR News, Rehoboth Beach, Delaware.
Vice President Harris will campaign in Wisconsin today. It's her first rally since Biden chose to leave the presidential race and endorsed Harris. The Associated Press says she has collected enough pledges from Democratic convention delegates to become the Democratic presidential nominee. European Union foreign ministers have met in Brussels. Terry Schultz says news of President Biden's decision to end his re-election bid was on their minds.
EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell declined to comment on the U.S. political scene, saying it was not his place to do so. Most foreign ministers just said they would work with whomever Americans choose as president. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock praised President Biden's long-standing commitment to improving the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. Hungary's government is the only one in the EU that has vocally praised former President Donald Trump.
Terry Schultz reporting. The Transportation Department will investigate Delta Airlines and its wide flight disruptions. These stem from last Friday's worldwide cyber outage. Most airlines have recovered from the outage, but thousands of Delta flights have been canceled. Cybersecurity researchers say it was a cyber attack targeting a Ukrainian energy facility that cut off heat to hundreds of apartment buildings in the city of Lviv back in January. As NPR's Jenna McLaughlin reports, they're warning those same tactics could be used against critical infrastructure around the world.
Cybersecurity firm Dragos focuses on protecting operational technology, the hardware and software used to control industrial equipment across sectors like water, power, and electricity. Working with experts in Ukraine, Dragos analyzed malware used to disrupt a local energy company in Lviv, Ukraine. The attack resulted in heating shut off for 600 apartment buildings across the city for 2 days in January. Researchers do not attribute the new tactics to a specific group or nation, but they say the hackers broke into commonly used devices that are designed to communicate commands to infrastructure like a heating system. The devices were exposed to the open internet. Under-resourced utilities like the water sector may struggle to defend against these kinds of attacks. Jenna McLaughlin, NPR News.
It's NPR.
It's now 4 minutes after 9. Good morning. This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Members of Florida's delegation to the Democratic National Convention threw their support yesterday to Vice President Kamala Harris a day after President Joe Biden dropped his reelection campaign. As part of a rapidly moving effort to coalesce support behind the vice president, a group of Florida party leaders held a call with reporters to back Harris's bid to become president. State Senator Chevron Jones pointed to increased enthusiasm, hoping that it translates down the ballot.
It is the Republicans' dream to sit back and watch us fight each other and create chaos. But we don't have to show them chaos. We can show them unity, and we can show them strength.
Moving equally as quickly, Republicans have pivoted their opposition from Biden to Harris. A Florida man who boasted that he was the wolf of Airbnb was sentenced yesterday to over 4 years in prison for defrauding New York City landlords and a federal pandemic relief government program. 32-year-old Conrad Bisher of Hialeah, Florida, was sentenced in Manhattan federal court. Bisher pleaded guilty about a year ago to wire fraud. Prosecutors say he operated at least 18 Manhattan apartments as mini hotels while using the pandemic as an excuse not to pay landlords more than $1 million in rents. It's now 80 degrees in Jacksonville, low 90s today.
Support for NPR comes from Amazon Business. From small business to big enterprise and everything in between, Amazon Business works to help simplify the supplies buying process. Learn more about smart business buying at amazonbusiness.com. This is NPR.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, mailers with horror movie fonts warning of monsters in the classroom. They began showing up in voter mailboxes recently. We explore who's paying for them and what they can teach us about the role of dark money in local politics. Later, conservation efforts in Nassau County get a major boost with 50,000 acres now earmarked for state preservation. But first, who is behind a series of scary mailers in the District 3 Duval County School Board race? The answer tells us a lot about local campaign financing, and to discuss it, I am joined by Megan Malakote. She is education reporter at Jacksonville Today and the person who researched and wrote this story. Welcome, Megan.
Good morning, Ann.
We're also joined by Duval County Election Supervisor Jerry Holland. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you, Ann, for having me.
Nice to see you again. So, Megan, I want to start with the story that you published recently in Jacksonville Today about some mailings in the Duval County District 3 School Board race. Why did you begin looking into that race in particular? It came in as a question to Jacksonville Today?
Yes, we had a reader email us a question. He'd received one of those, kind of large format postcards that had this, like, as you mentioned, this scary font on it, talked about monsters in the classroom. And he wanted to know more about who's behind the money, that those types of mailings do say, paid for by such and such a political action committee, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the committee. And so he wanted to know just more about the people behind it.
Mm-hmm. And so committees frequently do pay for ads that we see, whether they're on television or ones that show up in our mailbox. Who are these committees, broadly speaking, and how much information is available about them?
So I may need to defer to Jerry for his expertise, but my understanding of it is that political action committees are a way for candidates to get their message out, or for people who are in support of candidates, let's put it that way, to get their message out about a candidate. And they're not subject to the same limitations, financial limitations, that a candidate themselves may be. And so they'll use political action committees who can receive donations from the same types of people that would donate to candidates, and then they'll pay for these types of advertisements.
And in this case, it wasn't so much advocating for a candidate as it was trying to damage a candidate.
I think that's a good way to put it. Yes, this mailing was very anti Cindy Pearson and not pro Rebecca Nathanson. In fact, it didn't mention her. It was part of the District 3 school board race, and it was only against the incumbent candidate. It didn't name in any way the challenger.
And we had Cindy Pearson on yesterday. She's the incumbent. She's the one that was targeted by these ads. We're also going to have her opponent, Becky Nathanson, on August 1st as part of our ongoing election coverage. But Jerry Holland, tell us what we know about committee spending. There are limits on how a committee can collect money, how it can spend money, but there are a lot of rules that don't apply to individual donors, that wouldn't apply if you were an individual donor.
Yeah, it's different than the campaign contributions to the candidate. That's limited, maximum of $1,000 per individual, per corporation. Where when you go to the PAC, if a donor wants to give $1 million, there's no limitations. You know, how the money is used is different than in the campaign. Seems similar, and for voters, most of the time they don't notice the difference. As you mentioned, you know, a lot of times it's negative. In a PAC, it cannot advocate to vote for me. It cannot say on there, please vote for and name the candidate. But what is typically done is to, one, it can try to destroy the opponent. You know, these are all the evil reasons, and these are this person is evil. And on the other side, it can also be used to praise, you know, a candidate. So it's more used to, I call it, describe the character of the candidates more than to say, it won't say on there, even the negative won't say, don't vote for, because again, you're advocating to vote or not vote for something. But when the voters see these, they're really thinking, well, who's putting these out? Is it the candidate? And the candidate is supposed to be separate of the PAC, you know, so that's why often you'll hear in a campaign race, somebody will say all that negativity and they'll point to the candidate and candidates say, I've got nothing to do with this, you know. And in some lines of defense, that's true or can be true. But in many times, the same people supporting the candidate is also supporting the PAC, you know. So therefore, they have a common interest.
And they're not supposed to coordinate with a candidate, as you say. That's against the law. But does it also provide a bit of a cushion when you're talking about ugly ads or ads that are tearing down an opponent? It gives a little buffer so that it's not actually coming from a candidate. It's coming from this sort of nebulous organization.
Correct. It is coming from an organization, not from the candidate. Candidate is supposed to not be direct in. You know, as a candidate in 9 races, I've never used a PAC. But I think if I had a PAC and there were the same people supporting me as supporting the PAC, I'd want the PAC to know that, listen, I don't support negativity. I don't support, slams against my opponent or things of that nature. You have that right to tell your supporters, not to direct the PAC. The PAC can still say, you know what? It's our direction. We think it's important, and we're going to do this. So that's where the candidate's separate. But in the same sense, the candidate does have influence to possibly the same donors that are campaigning, you know, and helping the candidate.
Do you think that if a candidate made clear that they didn't want any part in negativity, that the PAC supporting them by and large would fall in line and do what the candidate wanted? Or in your experience, do they just disregard what their own candidate wants and plow ahead?
Well, the common link many times in the PAC and the candidate is the consultants. You know, so therefore, the consultant has one objective: win the race, you know, at all means and all costs. We've seen that in mayoral races, whatever it takes. And even the candidate saying, I'm doing this because I want to win, you know. So in that sense, you know, there's a separation. I think the candidate can influence the contributors, not that, you know, you have to separate the contributors to the PAC from the PAC, but it's kind of one of the same.
So you mentioned you've run in numerous elections. You were a former city council member. You were a former tax collector.
Property appraiser.
Excuse me, property appraiser. I always get those mixed up. And now supervisor elections for the second time. So you have been in a number of races. How has the changing world of campaign finance shaped, you know, politics in those years in perhaps a way that it's different than it was when you began?
Well, I think in all campaigns, there's an influence of how much money you can raise and the impact of it. But we've seen examples in many races where those who raise the most money don't always win. They even think that by raising the most money, you're going to win. But it's not necessarily the absolute recipe for success. So, but I have seen, obviously, the PACs and the influence of the PACs grow more. And the decision that consultants will say, I hate to use negativity, but it works. And although I think there are examples that it didn't work, I think it backfired in the mayoral race, you know, for the Republican candidate versus the Democratic candidate. So, you know, whether that will prove out over time and people start to say there could be a reaction to the negativity in this school board race. You know, why are you attacking like this? Those kind of things are again, It takes time to develop and really determine the impact, but they can have an impact over time.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the role of money in politics, including in our local school board races here in Duval County. I'm talking to Jacksonville Today reporter Megan Malacote and Duval County Supervisor of Elections Jerry Holland. You can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. We're interested in hearing from you if you have received any of these mailers. Megan, what were you able to find out in this particular case when you were trying to dig into who was funding these mailers that were arriving?
So it's a tedious process, but it is straightforward that there are records through the state elections office and also through your office. And this particular PAC was called Educated Professionals for Jacksonville, I believe. And so when you look at the records for that PAC, you can see that the people who registered it in late May, I believe, or at least it was finalized then. And then they pretty quickly received 2 donations of about $8,700 each, and then immediately spent it on printing at a local printer, which then coincides with the timing of when the mailers arrived. But it's kind of like what you mentioned a few minutes ago, is that when you look at the people who registered this PAC, they are also consistent donors of a particular candidate in this case. And so it also things like the local printer is also a printer that her campaign tends to use and things like that. So you can draw a pretty direct line, although there's no specific, line drawn between the candidate and the PAC, but you can see that the same people are involved in both things.
And you found that the chair of Educated Professionals is a woman who shares an address with someone.
Yes, with the local law office, which is the same place where the PAC is registered, use that same address. And so there's lots of kind of circular ties.
Okay. In terms of where they got that money, those 2 large donations of $87,000, what do we know about that?
Yeah, well, that was another interesting thing, and I'm glad you brought that up, is that the money that was the campaign contribution for the $8,700, the 2 of those contributions came from another business that's registered with the state in the same family's name. And so I think it was actually registered under this woman's daughter-in-law, and also at these same addresses again. And so you start to see a lot of these same things pop up again between addresses and names, and it's a handful of the same people involved in all aspects of this particular case.
So donors to these committees are public. That's a public record that you can pull.
Correct.
What is the role of something more like these 501c4s, Jerry Holland, which are very often financing political campaigns? What are they, and what role do they play?
Well, also, I wanted to comment also what you're saying about this was easier to follow because you actually could see the donors.
Right.
Where it gets difficult is PACs can give to PACs. Then you have to go to the PAC of realizing who gave to the PAC. And you can actually have multiple PACs down the road giving. So there is a way that you really never can find it.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the difficulties too, but totally legal and totally permissible. Back to your question, you have to look at the PACs, you have to look at EOCs,
EOCs,
election ECOs, election communication organizations. They're a little bit different than PACs. But I think you were talking about the 503c1s, then you get into on those, and correct me if I'm wrong, are getting into charitable organizations and stuff like that. There is lines where charitable organizations cannot contribute, in campaigns and things of that nature. So some of those, they have to look at their own, where it gets into is not election law violation, but tax law violation. And so where we're not involved in that, but obviously they can lose tax exempt status and things of that nature. So a lot of that can be very complicated, and often people can run awry without even realizing they're doing that.
The thing, Megan, about an organization that might be a nonprofit that is making donations to a political campaign is that they don't have the same disclosure deadline in terms of who's financing them as an election cycle.
Right. A nonprofit may or may not, depending on how they're structured, have to disclose their donors. There was a case a couple of years ago that the Miami Herald reported on in South Florida where a nonprofit group that was kind of hard to figure out who they were, and I think it was a city council race, I could be wrong, that had donated these massive amounts to a spoiler candidate that then kind of changed the way that the election outcome would have been predicted. And they had some documents leaked to the Herald that turned out that the donation to this nonprofit had come from Florida Power and Light. And so Florida Power and Light, of course, had vested interest in the outcome of this election and wanted to influence it, but didn't necessarily want to be connected to it. And so they donated to a nonprofit. And the only reason the Herald was able to determine that the Florida Power and Light was even behind it was because of these leaked documents, because the nonprofit had no obligation to report who their donors were. And so if a nonprofit then donates to a PAC, then donates to a PAC, then donates to a PAC, it creates this very tricky path to follow. And so as journalists, we can look it up. And I could have taken you back without the leaked records to the point where that PAC received a donation from the nonprofit, but I couldn't have told you anything more because nonprofits aren't obligated to say where their money comes from.
And that candidate, in my memory, was, very much in support of rooftop solar, which was something that the power company was not particularly interested in advancing.
Right.
But as you say, had those documents not actually been leaked to reporters, nobody would have been able to make that connection.
Right.
Jerry, is there any push for greater transparency in terms of PACs donating to PACs, donating to PACs?
No.
Okay.
And the reason I say that, just real quick and simple, both parties use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reality is it's to their advantage when they want to do it. And so you don't see it cleaned up. I was sharing with someone earlier, it's very similar to write-in candidates.
Mm-hmm.
The reality that we can close an election with a write-in candidate of the same party as the two people that are running, and then the person withdraw before the general election just to close it, seems a total just abomination of elections and the ethics behind it. But it's totally legal and both parties do it.
It's true.
We've got a couple of calls I want to take. Mark on the south side. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I wanted to, just say a comment about something. I believe it was Jerry that said or was discussing about negative campaigning, negative ads. I've been in sales for over 30 years, and one of the top rules in sales is you don't sell your product by knocking your competition's product. If you don't have the features that is going to, generate support for your product, you got a pretty sorry feature. And it drives me nuts that both sides of the political aisle always spend so much money on negative ads. They're just telling me why I should not vote for somebody else, not why I should vote for them. I just don't understand, and maybe you kind of mentioned that that might have helped Donna Deegan win her mayoral election. But are there other examples of folks who pledged, I'm not going to go after my competitor. I'd rather spend the money on telling you what I believe, things that I've done. Here's my track record, and sell the positive sides of themselves as a candidate.
Good question, Charles. How often do you see that?
Well, a lot of times you'll see the candidate who will say, I'm not going to use negativity. I'm not going to do that, is because they can't raise the money to do it. So it's an easy out, and it makes them look like they're a hero. And that may be their ethical stance, but it's one of the reasons is they don't. I'll never forget, I asked one of the consultants in the mayoral race that lost, I said, do you regret the way of the campaign was? And they said, oh, no, it was working. We just needed more time. So in the minds of consultants, negativity works. And you run on the campaign of this, vote for me because I'm not as bad as my opponent, and let me tell you how bad my opponent is.
We've got a message from Deb on Facebook. She says, so glad you're bringing this to light. Those mailers are disgusting. And Megan, we should say the allegations in those mailers very much try to make someone look almost like a sexual predator because they're based off some, unfortunate and criminal actions that occurred at a school here in Duval County.
Yes.
But they're trying to paint the school board member as a responsible party.
Right. They were non-credible allegations. I mean, I looked at the sources that they put on each of the postcards in, tiny fine print and then went back and pulled the meetings and watched each one of them to see what the discussion had been. And I came to the conclusion that they were very much taken out of context, which I suppose isn't surprising. But I don't know how many voters also then go to the sources that are listed on the postcards and make the choice for themselves. But yeah, they were not credible.
Jerry, I want to ask you about something you said, because you said, the parties want this. This is something that they would not necessarily fight to get rid of. Very often the donors, the large donors, are pushing for legislation that aligns with their bottom line, essentially. I mean, the large donors are very often in support of candidates and legislation that is about money for them. How much of this is about what the party wants as opposed to just what big donors want?
I think it's a combination of both, but the donors do feel like I have a greater influence if I want it based on how much I can contribute to it. Both the future obligations possibly of the candidate, as well as my ability to control the narrative because I can put enough money into it.
And so the law changed after the Citizens United decision. That was a Supreme Court decision, 2010,
Probably close to that.
And that basically equated money with speech, right? It's a freedom of speech issue. Money is the same as speech. And, if you carry that to its logical end, it basically says if you have more money,
you can speak more.
Yeah. In a louder voice.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, perhaps not. I don't know. Is that an appropriate way to? And I'm not asking you to second guess the Supreme Court. Obviously, their decision stands.
No, but you know where it may come back to, and I think we just talked about those mailers. The old saying is a half truth is also a half lie. If we can ever get to the point that we're not really saying the truth in our mailers and held accountable for that, then are the assuming based on what I'm saying that you extrapolate a different outcome. I'll never forget, I had an opponent one time, and he had turned me into like FDLE, Florida Ethics, about 6 different agencies, and reported. All of them said, there is nothing there, there's nothing. But what did his campaign ad read? He has been investigated by Florida Department of Law Enforcement, by the Florida Ethics, by the IG's office. He's been investigated by all these. True. But nothing was coming. But how do you kind of take these ads back into a true truth meter and say, yeah, but what you're trying to say is this, but what you're saying is this. If we can ever get that, it wouldn't matter how much money people would put in. I see nothing wrong with a side-by-side comparison. My opponent voted for this. I voted for this. My opponent supports this. I support that. Know the difference between the two opponents. But when you start making these sort of half-truths that leads you to a half-lie, that's where we have a problem.
How much of that happens where you see someone actually ceding ground prior to an election by filing scurrilous complaints? I mean, that seems like an extraordinary amount of pre-planning. Is that unusual?
It is not unusual, and you do see that. And they just discover it by chance in a sense also. They go back and look and say, oh, let's look at this. The greatest example I always love is I think Scott Wilson was running for clerk of the courts. He had gone to the baseball game with some of the mayor's staff and the consultant and the JEA person.
During the JEA sale
while he
process.
was council president.
Right.
These were what he considers friends taking him to the game. The same consultant used it against him in the campaign ad. So even though you may one day think they're your friends, don't think that a consultant won't use it against you in the future.
To be clear, the consultant that he was with at that baseball game in Atlanta then used that photograph of him at the baseball game with the consultant.
Yes.
That's wild. I didn't know that.
Yes.
How did Scott Wilson fare in that election?
He lost.
Oh.
Yeah.
Denise on Facebook says negative ads work because people love entertainment. It ain't negative if it's the truth. Megan, have you heard from any people in your reporting on this story about whether they consider these ads effective, whether they might sway their position?
The only anecdotal feedback I've received is actually that it was a little over the top, that it may sway their position, but not in the way that the PAC intended for it to be swayed. So, but it's hard to say that it reached a lot of people, and I certainly haven't heard from everybody.
We also have a message from Charshus on Facebook. It says, if you are the right candidate for the job, your qualifications and visions should be sufficient to earn votes without resorting to speaking negatively about your opponent. Focusing on your own accomplishments and plans demonstrates your confidence and readiness to serve rather than deflecting attention away from your own record. I would guess one thing that has changed a little bit over time as well, Jerry, is newspapers and how thoroughly and deep they're able to cover things like money and politics. It used to be a very routine step in reporting on elections, and there's just fewer reporters out there.
And especially locally, as you've seen and witnessed over your time and career, and what the average voter is looking for information from. They just aren't taking the paper. They may read some things online. So how much they get in these mailers are definitely impacting the vote and how it's influenced. Because again, no matter even if you don't want to listen to it, you hear it and it impacts you. You do think about it. I'm thinking of the ads right now for the state Senate position. And we hear the negativity on both of those. It's amazing that you'll hear how liberal someone is, and then you'll see who their endorsements are, and you say, how can this be? So it's confusing to voters. And they'll call us and say, can you give us information on the candidates? And I'm like going, it's not our role, because somehow, we can point you in the direction, but if we start giving, it'll be slanted. Sounds like you're only giving the positive for this one or negative for this one. So it's not the elections office. The voter has to do their own research.
Mm-hmm. Is there more that the elections office could do to make research available or to make those kinds of documents available? Megan has taught journalism at University of Florida. She's got a long history as a reporter. She knows her stuff, but not everybody knows how to do that kind of research.
They really don't. Now, we try to point them in direction. We do get any of the candidate information and share that. If you want to, I always say, reach out to the candidate. You'll be surprising, especially when we're talking local levels, how many of these school board candidates, you can reach out to them. They'll reach back to you. They'll talk to you. This can happen in local elections where obviously on a state level or national level it doesn't, but local it can.
And so if somebody wants to get that information on your website, how do they dig into that, or at the state election website?
When you go to our website, on the front page at the very top, candidate information, it'll direct you so that you can go find some of that information. So it is on our homepage.
And Megan, as part of Jacksonville Today's coverage of the election, they are doing candidate profiles. They are reaching out to all of the candidates. And that information is going to be available pretty soon.
Yes, we're working on a voter guide, and I believe August 1st is our target date for publication, and we're contacting each of the candidates and trying to have them each answer the same questions for at least in each race that we've come up with, and then have so that people can have a source to go to look and read about the candidate in their own words. We're not editing it in any way. We're just taking the words of the candidate and publishing it.
And are you planning on doing any more reporting on money in politics in the local races?
I think that money in politics always leads to interesting stories. So as the opportunity arises, definitely.
Yeah. Jerry Holland, any thoughts that you have about this election just writ large? It's a difficult time for any supervisor of elections. And I feel like I just have to ask you, in terms of conveying, the message of, is this election reliable? How you're responding to challenges on that front, including from people in your own party?
Well, what I say to all election officials, and I share with our voters, is this: all election officials should be transparent. If you have any questions, ask them. We should be forthright, bringing those answers to you. We give tours of our election center. We want you to see how we keep the equipment secure, how we tabulate the equipment, how secure that is, the entire process. We do not want you not to vote because you believe like your vote won't count. So we will take the time, explain that to individuals, to groups, go out to groups. It's important to us to bring the confidence back into the elections. And so that's our number one role.
Charles on the West Side has a question for you, Jerry. Go ahead, Charles.
Hey, good morning. I was wondering, Jerry, I recently started reading about these entities called SPACs. How are they different from your regular PAC?
Like a super
and
PAC?
Just as I guess, yeah. I noticed the whole acronym was SPACs. So is that a super PAC or something different?
Thanks, Charles.
That's a good question, Charles. And really, from my understanding, a super PAC is more on the federal election cycle than it is on the local. There is not a super PAC, that you file locally or with the state. So I think that's more a federal entity, which we do not handle within our office. And also the PACs locally, there are PACs that are filed within our office that we're responsible for, and there's PACs they file within the state. And people say, why would they do one versus the other? It's a reporting time period. Also, when you report the local, when you report the state. And so sometimes it can allow a person to hold back that information longer. So a lot of people will, again, use different PACs for manipulating the time period in which they have to report.
We also have a comment from Yasmina on Facebook. She's wondering, have we seen PACs used in school board elections before?
I believe we had some in the previous, this was before I came back in this time last year, but I think we did have some in the race out at the beaches, that particular pack out. I think there was a pack for that candidate.
Mm-hmm. In the 2022 election, there were some of the same PACs that are giving to each other now and making that trail of money from large PAC to medium PAC to small PAC and so forth. Some of those same groups were involved in the school board election last time.
Gotcha. We have a question or a comment from Stanley on the north side. Good morning, Stanley.
Yes, good morning. My question is to Jerry. Jerry, yes, it may be legal for have a PAC, but is it ethical? That's my concern here, because a lot of that dog money, which started out with the Republicans during the Reagan time, has made an impact on the election process and also caused people to not participate in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. There's no doubt that there's a line drawn there between what's legal and what you feel like is ethical. And that goes back to the way in which you use the money, how you're distorting the message. The fact of PACs, of getting messages out and being able to explain, and obviously, as the Supreme Court ruled on the freedom of speech of contributing, yes, you can't limit that. But I think it really comes back to the integrity of the PAC on how they're going to give out their messaging and how it's going to be really truthful or not.
Just in terms of the sheer amount of money, Megan, we're talking about PAC money, but just in terms of the cash that's going into that particular school board race, how does it compare, for what you know from previous years or just from this election cycle compared to the other races?
In Duval County, I would say that it's one of the most well-funded races I want to say it's maybe between the two candidates, I think they're up to like $150,000 total, which is much bigger than some of the surrounding areas. Like if you look at school board races in our neighboring counties, they might be $10,000 or $5,000 races.
Wow.
So they're quite large here. But the amount of money funding PACs that are then funding PACs that are then funding PACs, I mean, we're talking some PACs that deal in the tens of millions of dollars.
These two candidates have roughly even Steven funding so far.
The incumbent is a little behind. The challenger, Nathanson, has, I think the last time I looked, maybe $10,000 or $15,000 more.
Are those eye-opening numbers to you in a school board race in Duval County, or have we seen that before?
No, it's growing in the sense of how much more is given to school board races. I think emphasis has been put on school board races, even from as high as level as the governor's office, putting emphasis on school board races. I think before it was not elevated to the same height as even council races, of money being spent and the need of having someone of one background or another. But now I think you'll not just see it now, I think you'll see it even more so in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I talked to the party chairs for both the Republicans and the Democrats in the process of reporting the story, and the Republican Party chair specifically said, yes, these are nonpartisan races, but we decided a couple of years ago, hey, let's just treat them as partisan. I think partially because of what they had seen from the governor's office, and partially simply because that it helps them accomplish their goals for the community if even the school boards have the candidates that they support in place. And so you'll see support from the Republican Party as well come into these races.
And we know that in November, voters will be deciding whether or not to permanently make school board races partisan. That's going to be on the ballot, and we're going to be talking about that a little closer to the November.
Yes, but most school board races will be decided in the primary in August.
True. And so they will be decided currently in a nonpartisan fashion, at least in theory.
Yes, so vote both times because...
Yeah, right. Well, Jerry Holland, Megan Malicote, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ann.
Coming up next, a push to conserve historically and ecologically significant 5,000 acres of potential conservation land in Nassau County could soon fall under the state's Protected Lands Program. Joining me to talk about it is Logan Cross. He's chair of the Sierra Club of Northeast Florida. Nice to see you, Logan.
Glad to be here, Ann.
So to start by telling us about this property, where is this 55,000 acres and why is it significant?
Well, this area, it's often referred to as the Atlantic to Okefenokee Conservation Land Corridor. And the properties, it extends from over around Fernandina all the way over to the Georgia-Florida line, the St. Mary's River near the Okefenokee Swamp. and it includes some forested areas that are already secured and that type of thing. A lot of that area is not overtly developed at this time. So it's this decision to add it to the Florida Forever priority list is a major move towards giving the tools to secure those properties. It doesn't automatically secure them.
This 55,000 acres is a goal to acquire that entire parcel, or is that the border of what is now under consideration for acquisition?
Well, the goal is to secure as much of it as possible. And the northern boundary of this property is the St. Mary's River. And I think the goal of the Nassau County has a program called the Conservation Lands Acquisition and Management Program. They've worked in conjunction with the North Florida Land Trust to try to get this property or this section included in the Florida Forever's priorities list. What that does is it increases the likelihood that they can acquire the funding needed to get the conservation easements or make outright purchases of the properties. And once the properties are either acquired or you get a conservation easement on it, that means that it's no longer subject to development. And anyone who's paying attention to Nassau County these days knows that there's the beginning of a northward expansion of development that has historically been going southward into St. Johns County. It's starting to go northward into Nassau County.
Yeah, and there's some massive changes underway in Nassau County. Almost every time you go there, you see large-scale new developments. Wildlight certainly is one of the largest. That's basically a Nocatee-sized development that runs from Yulee to the Georgia border.
Yeah, that's a prime example. It is. I think that's a good analogy, Nocatee, and that just like Nocatee started then in St. Johns County, then you had your other developments on the other side of the interstate, and largely in St. Johns County, it's, from my perspective, is largely uncontrolled, and it's a type thing that's what makes what's happening in Nassau County a little bit unique, in that the Nassau County itself is committing itself to trying to help preserve these lands, and that's why they started working with the North Florida Land Trust to try to set up a mechanism where they can secure these properties. I don't want to cast light on St. Johns County, but you don't hear about any of that going on in St. Johns County.
Yeah, and we should say this is a partnership between Nassau County, as you say, the North Florida Land Trust. We weren't able to get either of those entities on the program today, but they have been working together to get this deal done. North Florida Land Trust is an organization that is not about really coercion for conservation. It tries to either buy land or have people donate conservation easements on their property.
Right. What they don't try to coerce, they try to facilitate. When you have property owners who have sufficient land that they want to make sure it is secured in a natural state, let's say it's farmland or whatever, the North Florida Land Trust can help them either get an outright purchase for the property, or they could get a conservation easement so that it's no longer subject to development. So they do a wonderful job in terms of their efforts to preserve properties here in Northeast Florida, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that.
Some of the lands in this giant parcel are very ecologically or environmentally sensitive. Others are perhaps less so. They might be tree farms, something like that has already been kind of turned over from nature into an agricultural use. But there is value in just taking land off the table from a development standpoint. Explain why that is. Why does that matter?
Well, I think a good example of that is here in Jacksonville, a little bit closer to Jacksonville. A lot of people may be familiar with the Seven Creeks recreational area, which is out off near Heckscher Drive largely. And it's kind of a collection of preserved properties. It includes national parks, state parks, and city parks, and some other areas that were preserved or conserved by the North Florida Land Trust. You put them all together and you've got a wonderful recreational area out there for people who like kayaking, hiking, or just getting out in nature. But also you've got an area that serves a very vital purpose in, I would say, everything from maintaining water health and our health of our river and things like that. It also provides valuable habitat for wildlife. It's like some of the areas down in St. Johns County, our Sierra Club got contacted. The development was threatening things such as bald eagle nests and things. So you can have some very unique species that need to be preserved. So this creation of an area like that, or the Severn Creeks recreational area, are vital in that regard.
And as we know, I mean, some of the lands up in that area are slated to begin flooding pretty routinely in the near future. So it's, I mean, also probably serves a purpose in terms of keeping that land out of the path of development and then, potentially damaging floods. Yes, many of those areas are low-lying areas and are subject to flooding, whether it's due to storm surge or hurricanes in general. And one thing we've learned that areas can be low-lying areas and still development can occur in those areas. Yeah. So you put homes in peril essentially when you build in those areas. But I want to make another point that's, I think, important to not lose sight of is if we look on a larger scale of climate change and global warming, the more we can preserve these large natural areas, they serve a role not only in what is called carbon capture, reducing the carbon that makes its way into the atmosphere, but also it has a cooling effect. And that's one thing that if we've learned, when you clear large areas, like in these developments where they just go in and clear cut a lot of the trees, you're creating an area that's very vulnerable to heat because there's really no shade there. But also you're removing the trees and the role that they could play in carbon capture. I want to just touch on the issue of Florida Forever. So that's a fund that's used to purchase conservation lands. It's what would purchase this conservation land.
Well, the funds become available, and then an entity like the North Florida Land Trust would come in, facilitate the purchases, and that. So think of the Florida Forever as fund as a pool of money. Now, it's not automatically funded. That's where politics comes into play. Each year, the governor and the legislature makes decisions on how much money they're going to make available for land acquisition. And that's why, even if this is on the Florida Forever priority list, there will be the additional step where you have to get the money allocated through the state legislature and the governor.
And there was a time when Florida Forever was routinely funded in the early 2000s, $300 million a year or so. And then under Governor Rick Scott, it was actually zeroed out at one point. So there was no money to buy land like this. And then the voters weighed in and said, we want to approve a law that mandates a certain amount of money dedicated to this fund. But that hasn't always necessarily created that fund. No, that amendment was referred to as Amendment 1. It was passed back in 2014, and that was overwhelmingly approved by the voters. 75% of the voters who voted to approve that the money should be available. But then a lot of the politics come into play in that the politicians decide how much they're going to implement that legislation. Well, Logan Cross, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on and telling us about this project.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Stick around. We'll be back with a swimming program that appeals to everyone's senses all across the spectrum.
Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
China has the second biggest economy on the planet, but its growth...
You're in good company. Tips on finding work that works for you. Next time, Here and Now.
Today at 2 on WJCT News 89.9.
More than a century ago, a company called Calum helped Jacksonville become the winter film capital of the world, a reputation that lasted only a decade. Hear the fascinating true story on Bygone Jacks, Our Unsung History, a podcast from WJCT Public Media.
presidential election campaign has been upended. Democrats look to rally behind a new nominee. Time is short. How will the party meet this moment, and what role do other leading figures play on the reconfigured ticket? Our coverage continues, guided by your questions and comments. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
And we're back. Drowning is the #1 cause of death for children ages 1 to 4, and that risk is especially acute with kids with autism. But there are water safety programs that are designed especially for young kids and kids with autism, I should say. And here to discuss it is Dustin Rulian, Aquatics Director at the Jewish Community Alliance. Good morning, Dustin.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So kids with autism are 160 times more likely to die by drowning than their peers. And it's actually the leading cause of death for young kids with autism. This is mostly due to accidental drownings. So how did your organization come to focus on children on the spectrum when it comes to teaching water safety?
Well, looking at those statistics, we wanted to branch out and really provide an opportunity for these children to be included.
They're at special risk in part because children with autism are very often prone to wandering.
That's correct.
But also drawn to water.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's due to the sensations of water or lack of sensory input.
So how is teaching a child who has a neurodivergent mind differ from teaching kids who are just don't have that diagnosis?
It really depends child to child. This program is one-on-one. It allows us to meet children where they are and satisfy their needs.
Yeah. And so how does that process begin? How do you assess what they need and who makes that assessment?
Yeah, it again really depends on the child. The instructors meet with the children and get in the pool with them, and it's kind of assessed as we go.
Yeah. And so what are you looking for in terms of what they may or may not need to be told or how to approach instructing them?
Yeah, so we're looking for different sensory inputs that may affect the child's learning. Fears are a big part of it. Sometimes we may have to clear our indoor pool for these lessons. They are one-on-one with an instructor, and each instructor is patient and looking for different cues on how to approach the situation.
And so what are some tactics for overcoming fears or communicating, special skills in terms of acquiring the basics?
Well, part of the fears begin with the parents because they're nervous because their child has special needs. But many of the fears also come from the participants, and it's just showing that they can develop, they can do these things. They are included in this program.
Does your team need special training to do the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, every one of my instructors is a Red Cross water safety instructor, and as part of that certification, they do receive special training for Sensory Safe.
And so, how long does it typically teach? Is it similar to teaching other children, or does the process take longer because it's one-on-one?
Well, it really depends on what your goals are. Many sensory safe of our sensory safe participants just want to be able to enjoy the water and be safe in the water at the same time. If your goal is to work towards swim team, we had 2 children actually be able to be a part of swim team, one through Special Olympics and one is part of our summer swim team this year, which was an awesome achievement.
Congratulations. That's terrific. There have been in recent years, I feel like, a movement even with everybody to teach children who are very young water safety, if not swimming per se, but starfish lessons where they lay on their back and they learn to float and await rescue so that they don't drown if they find themselves in water. Is that the kind of thing that you teach, or are you really teaching more of a traditional, this is how you turn your head and swim through the water like a swimmer?
I'd say more of a hybrid. We don't teach ISR, infant survival. That tends to have an impact on their development further down the line as far as learning stroke technique. I only
Interesting.
typically
How
recommend
so?
those lessons if somebody's at an extreme risk.
How does it affect their learning down the line?
It can create some fear of the water. Those lessons are very brash. They can be very rough on some participants. On top of that, just the techniques they learn are hard to break.
I've seen it recommended that parents who have whose child receives a diagnosis that they're on the autism spectrum are basically told as soon as you can to teach the child water safety and how to swim. Is there an age range that you particularly cater to? Do you think, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of times those diagnoses don't come until a child is maybe around, 2 late 1 years old. So they're typically not infants when they're diagnosed.
Yeah, and 2 years old is typically my recommendation for the earliest that our lessons begin. The only program that we have that begins earlier than 2 is our Parent and Me lessons, which is parents in the water with an instructor and their child to get them comfortable.
And do you do any special instructions with the parents when you're teaching their child water safety? Do they have to participate? Should they participate? Is it helpful?
It depends on the program. All of our parents are supplied with information this is in all of our aquatics programs, with information on water safety because it begins with the parents. We don't just teach swimming, we teach water safety.
Well, Dustin Rulin, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our program. We encourage your feedback and suggestions, and you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Join us tomorrow when we look at Florida's Amendment 4 on abortion and how a new financial impact statement could have broad political implications. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. WindGuard is a marketing and communications agency dedicated to creating share-worthy social content. From social strategy to content creation, you can tag them in today. More at wearewindguard.com. The Cummer Museum of Art and Garden's new exhibition, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, on view through September 29th. Visit cummermuseum.org for more information.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.